Boy, oh boy, you've just got to love the pain of fantasy football, don't you? A.J. Brown is all of a sudden Mr. One Target. Xavier Worthy's shoulder is made of glass, and Christian McCaffrey's calf has got the entire fantasy community in complete shambles. Well, if any of those circumstances have you worried for your fantasy roster, don't worry. I've got our last-minute waiver wire targets together to help save what is already looking like a very frustrating fantasy season for you. Let's start with none other than Hollywood Brown of the Kansas City Chiefs, who had to step up in big fashion in week 1 in Brazil against the Chargers with no Rashee Rice on the field and Xavier Worthy going down by some friendly fire, ultimately with a shoulder injury. Now, we don't know how long Worthy's going to be out. We don't know the severity of the injury at the time I am recording this, but we look down the line here. Hollywood Brown, 16 targets, 10 catches, 99 receiving yards, and 19.9 PPR fantasy points. Juju Smith-Schuster, not too shabby here. I mean, 5 targets, 5 catches, 55 receiving yards, 10.5 PPR points for him. Then Tyquan Thornton, 4 targets, 2 receptions, 41 receiving yards, 6.1 PPR points for him. I'm not going to break down the tight ends. Like, we did see some involvement out of Noah Gray, and although Travis Kelce didn't have a great game, he ultimately found the end zone towards the end of the game, right? But what we want to look at here is, even though we don't know the true severity of Xavier Worthy's injury, Hollywood Brown is basically the first man up, and I think that was undoubtedly proven in this matchup against the Chargers with the 16 total targets. Now, you guys see that week 2 matchup on the screen. The Philadelphia Eagles is going to be a tough matchup overall. Then they get the Giants, Baltimore, Jacksonville, Detroit, Las Vegas. I mean, it's a pretty up and down couple of weeks here until week 7 against the Raiders, once again, when Rashee Rice will at least be on the field if Xavier Worthy isn't. But hey, short-term play here, Hollywood Brown, I would say go all in on waivers if you're hurting at the wide receiver position. And ultimately, at the end of the day, this is just a situation that we have to pay attention to going into week 1's weekend, even though this game for the Chiefs has already been played in week 1. Going into week 2 as well, this is a player right now in terms of a last-minute waiver addition that you guys absolutely need to be considering. Next up, I want to talk about Cedric Tillman of the Browns, sitting around 33% rostered at the time I'm recording this. Gets a nice matchup in week 1 against the Cincinnati Bengals, who actually surprisingly only allowed the 14th fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers last year, but we're all expecting a very good game script here in terms of points potentially scored in week 1. But we could seriously see Cedric Tillman come out and have a very nice game. Jerry Jeudy, obviously the wide receiver 1. David Njoku, I think, is going to have a lot of involvement in this game, but we know that Joe Flacco is going to be flinging it. We know that both of these secondaries for the Browns and the Bengals are poor enough that we should see points scored in this game. That's what everybody is expecting. And Cedric Tillman is definitely a player who could step up in large fashion. So a player who, if he plays well enough in week 1, is ultimately going to be worth rostering in terms of a potential flex option with a decent matchup in week 2 against Baltimore, who I know looks very good on paper, but that secondary played very poor in terms of fantasy points allowed to wide receivers last year. So keep a close eye on Ced Tillman is essentially the point I'm making here. If he has a big week 1, he's going to be an option potentially in the flex as the season progresses. Next up, a name I've talked a lot about throughout the course of the week is Adam Thielen of the Minnesota Vikings, sitting around 50% rostered at the time I'm recording this. Doesn't have the best week 1 matchup against the Chicago Bears, but ultimately isn't going to be lining up as a true wide receiver 1 with Justin Jefferson on the field, so there should be some opportunity there, as Jordan Addison, we know, is set to miss the first 3 games of the season. And that's been my big point with Thielen all week long. If you've been hurting at wide receiver, week 2, he's going to get the Falcons. Week 3, he's going to get the Bengals. And you know, it could be too late if he has a big game against one of those 2 much poorer secondaries over the next 2 weeks, especially Atlanta in week 2. And ultimately, even when Jordan Addison returns from suspension, there's definitely a likelihood that Adam Thielen can carve out some type of role throughout the continuous of the season. So if Adam Thielen's sitting out there, you're hurting at wide receiver, you got nobody to play in the flex, I think he's okay in week 1, but ultimately the play here is to try and have him on your roster for weeks 2 and 3 if you need some flex value. All right, you know he was not going to not be in today's video. We're talking about Quentin Johnston of the LA Chargers, sitting at 9% roster, going to get a week 2 matchup against the Las Vegas Raiders. And Quentin Johnston, 24.9 fantasy points against the Chiefs in week 1. The highest scoring pass catcher on the entire Chargers roster. No Trey Harris, no Keandre Lambert-Smith. We did get some nice Keenan Allen action in this game. He sits at 61% rostered. I'm actually surprised that he's only 61% rostered. This is a player that I drafted a ton of, that we talked a lot about throughout the course of draft season. Keenan Allen's out there, definitely worth adding. 10 targets, 7 receptions, 68 receiving yards, a touchdown, 19.8 PPR points. And then we'll just go ahead and mention Ladd McConkey still had a good enough game with 13.4 PPR points, 9 targets, 6 catches, 74 receiving yards. But Quentin Johnston is a player that I would mention throughout the course of drafting underdog teams. Like, I don't think Quentin Johnston is just completely dead in the water. He can certainly have some sort of role in this offense, and he's always had a good red zone chemistry with Justin Herbert, and we saw that in week 1 in that Brazil game against Kansas City Chiefs last night. We look at the upcoming stretch at Las Vegas, Denver at home, at the Giants, Washington at home, at Miami, Indianapolis at home. There's going to be some of these matchups, especially against softer defenses, that I think Quentin Johnston can have a role. Now, I will say this is one of those like kind of flex plays that it's going to be risky at times. It's going to be hard to call when he has these spike weeks. I do think that there will still be down weeks for Quentin Johnston, but the involvement in the offense in last night's game was certainly very promising. So don't get me wrong, we don't want to go out spending all of our fab just based on one performance in week 1 on guys like Hollywood Brown or Quentin Johnston, but we have to look at what did happen and what played out in the upcoming circumstances. So it might depend on your guys' specific leagues and how waivers work. You may or may not be able to put in a bid or try to add Hollywood or Quentin Johnston until we get into the next waiver period. Regardless, these are players that absolutely need to be on your radar here at the end of week 1. All right, getting back into some names that could help you going into the weekend. Let's talk about Demario Douglas of the New England Patriots. Sitting around 23% roster at the time I'm recording this. He will get the Raiders in week 1. And we just have to remember this Josh McDaniels system plays through the slot wide receiver. So don't get me wrong, Stephon Diggs is going to be the guy here. I think Hunter Henry will be plenty involved in this Mike Vrabel, coach team is going to try and establish the run and play defense. I don't know how much they're going to run it necessarily, but at the end of the day, I do think that Demario Douglas out of the slot is going to have a decent role in this offense. Like guys like Kayshon Boutte, Mac Hollins, preseason hero Efton Chisholm, I just don't see them carving out a super large role going into the year. So Demario Douglas for me is one of those guys who kind of lives in that area of like 9 to 12 PPR points if he doesn't score, but in softer matchups is always a viable option if you are in a deeper format looking for a safe floor. So not calling anything crazy here, but I do think due to the nature of this system and him being utilized in the slot that he could definitely have moments throughout the course of this season. Week 1, like you guys see, the Raiders. Week 2, the Dolphins. Week 3, the Steelers, the Panthers, the Bills, the Saints, the Titans, the Browns, the Falcons, all the way through week 9. Then actually week 10, the Bucks. So there are some really good matchups here. A couple tough matchups like Pittsburgh, and I mean maybe you could even argue here week 1 against the Raiders, who only allowed the 10th fewest fantasy points to wide receivers last year. But there will be moments here, I think, for Demario Douglas as long as he's healthy. Once again, not a high ceiling play, but if you guys are hurting for depth at the wide receiver position, or you just need a kind of dart throw for a safe floor, I think Demario Douglas can be that guy. All right, I'm going to mention him one last time. We have talked about him a ton throughout the course of week 1 preparation. That's rookie wide receiver Donta Thornton of the Raiders, sitting around 40% rostered, and this is a player that has slowly moved up and roster percentage owned throughout the course of the week. He was sitting about 30% rostered just a week ago and has shot up to 40% rostered. And I think ultimately this is just the player on the Raiders at the wide receiver position who has the most upside, who could definitely be out there and available in your league. He's a good stash. I'm not saying go out and start him in week 1 necessarily. It's not the best starting overall schedule for the Raiders either. But once again, it's looking like Jacoby Myers is going to be here, not going to get traded, going to be the wide receiver 1. Amari Cooper's gone, retired, right? And Trey Tucker will have a role here in this. We know they're going to run more with Ashton Genty. We know Brock Bowers is there at the tight end position, but Donta Thornton, great chemistry throughout the course of the offseason, preseason with quarterback Geno Smith. I like Thornton. I'm not going to beat a dead horse here and tell you guys all the reasons why, but ultimately he is worth rostering, worth seeing how this plays out, and he has a lot of upside as we move into week 1's weekend. Next up, let's talk about another rookie wide receiver. That is Elk A.O. Manor of the Tennessee Titans, and we got some promising coach speak out of head coach Brian Callahan going into week 1, saying that Elk A.O. Manor, quote unquote, has earned himself the right to be called a starter. And I don't want to completely overreact here. I do like A.O. Manor as, a rookie prospect, but we still have Tyler Lockett hanging around. And I won't make a huge case for Van Jefferson or anything necessarily here. We know Calvin Ridley is the wide receiver 1 and Chicken Conquo hanging around at the tight end position as well. But all I will say is that, maybe A.O. Manor still needs to somewhat beat out Tyler Lockett ultimately for touches, but I guess I should say targets, but I don't really know if that's going to take incredibly long here, and I think that the upside certainly lies with A.O. Manor. We get this tough matchup in week 1 against the Denver Broncos, but we would expect Pat Surtain to be on Calvin Ridley a majority of this game. Week 2, they get the Rams and the Colts and the Texans and the Cardinals, the Raiders. It's a bit up and down here, but I do think that A.O. Manor could end up being, a player that has a lot of value. I always talk about rookie quarterbacks who go into the season with a rookie wide receiver. Generally, we see some sort of chemistry established between the two because they're stuck together a lot of time throughout the course of preseason and training camp. So I like A.O. Manor. I don't think he's anything more than a stash right now, and he has moved up a little bit in roster percentage, closer to actually 25% roster at the time I'm recording this. When I put together the video, it was sitting at 22% rostered, so may move a little bit throughout the course of the weekend, but certainly keep an eye. He is a rookie to stash who could have some upside in the coming weeks. Last wide receiver I'll mention is Jaden Higgins of the Texans, and he does sit at 72% rostered or around that mark, but the big knock here is that Christian Kirk is out for week 1, dealing with a hamstring injury. And yes, go ahead and let me hear it in the comments if you guys have been following the channel throughout the course of the offseason, because I drafted a ton of Christian Kirk as a late round wide receiver. And here we are week 1 with no Christian Kirk. Now, I do want to say this, right? Jaden Higgins was already going to be in some formations and 3 wide receiver sets on the field. Jalen Noel sits at 7% rostered. He is technically the backup slot wide receiver, so he could certainly see an uptick in usage. So keep a close eye on Jalen Noel as well. Is going to have a bigger role, and I don't think you should necessarily start Jaden Higgins in week 1, but we look forward here. Week 2, the Bucks. Week 3, the Jags. Week 4, the Titans. Week 5, the Ravens before an early week 6 bye week. We don't know how long Christian Kirk's going to be out. We don't know if there's going to be a re-aggravation of the injury, whatever it may be. If Jaden Higgins is sitting out there on the waiver wire, he should definitely be added, and we want to pay close attention to Jalen Noel and this offense that's been extremely pass-heavy over the last 2 seasons in the terms as long as Christian Kirk is out. So just watch the situation throughout the course of the weekend, see how it plays out, but for now, I would say if Higgins is out there and available, he is certainly worth the waiver wire addition. And in terms of the running back position, I don't think there's anybody you necessarily need to fly to the waiver wires to add. We've talked about all these guys on the screen throughout the course of the past week or so. I really think we're looking at primarily stashes. So you guys can just take a look at this screen, but we'll just quickly kind of go over here. Ollie Gordon sits at 61% rostered around that mark, but it does look like Devon Achane is going to be good to go week 1. Still worth rostering in case there's a re-aggravation of the calf injury. Ollie Gordon is a strong handcuff. Chris Rodriguez, I think, is really interesting. You look at the Vegas lines going into this matchup against the Giants in week 1, and they do have Chris Rodriguez as the potential highest rusher between Bill and Austin Eckler and Rodriguez. And I just think he's a good player to kind of hold on to in case he does end up getting the most volume, but still going to be a really aggravating RB by committee situation there. Dylan Sampson, Jerome Ford, whoever you're going to take a shot on in terms of the Browns running backs, if they're out there, they are good stashes and a decent week 1 matchup against the Bengals that should have at least lots of points scored one way or another. Rico Dowdle, I'm just calling my shot. It's a good matchup against the Jags. I think Chuba is undoubtedly the guy, but I still think that Rico Dowdle is a strong handcuff. You could have some standalone value. Don't forget about my boy, Rachaad White. He is off the injury report. He's one of the best handcuffs in fantasy football. I know you guys hate Rachaad White. I get it. Bucky Irving's the guy. I completely agree. But Rachaad White can have standalone value, and God forbid if something happens to Bucky Irving, you know Rachaad White will be the RB1. So if you're hurting at running back, he's off the injury report. Braylon Allen still sits at just around 55% rostered. We could see a 1A, 1B type situation play out there for the Jets between him and Breece Hall. Another very strong handcuff, but not a great week one matchup against the Steelers. Then we all know the Texans kind of have a big question mark at running back between Nick Chubb, Woody Marks, Dameon Pierce. Some people taking a shot on Dameon Pierce. I still like the upside of Woody Marks. He sits around 22% roster. You could take a look there. I think Justice Hill gets kind of commonly forgotten about, and I guess we are now going to mention Keaton Mitchell, who I've seen start to make some waves in terms of a potential upside pickup as well. But there is going to be a handcuff to Derrick Henry. I truly don't believe Derrick Henry's ever going to get hurt, I feel like, but if he does get hurt, Justice Hill does have some standalone value. We saw that at times last year, and essentially impossible to call win, but we did get involved in the passing game or scored a touchdown. And Keaton Mitchell does have some nice upside. I will agree with that. So they sit both around 10, 11% rostered. And you can take a shot on the Ravens' potential backup running back if you wanted to. All right, if you guys missed the video earlier in the week in terms of quarterback and tight end streaming options for the week, I will quickly go over these names as well because they have not changed for me. First of all, Justin Fields, worth rostering. Not a good week one matchup, but if he's out there floating on the waiver wire, which in some leagues he is, it gets better in terms of the strength of schedule over the next couple weeks, and he still has plenty of upside. Don't love him in week one against Pittsburgh, but he will be a streaming option and potentially a starter as the season goes on. We got Bryce Young in a great matchup against the Jacksonville Jaguars. Don't think his upside is as high as the other quarterback in this matchup, but he's still a quarterback that can give you a safe enough floor in a matchup that I think is going to be ultimately really, really good for fantasy football. So if you have nothing better at quarterback, Bryce Young might be out there floating around, still worth adding. But like I said, the quarterback with the most upside in that matchup, who gets a very good matchup against the Panthers, who allowed the 29th most fantasy points to quarterbacks last year, is Trevor Lawrence, who certainly could be out there floating on the waiver wire, sitting around 48 to 50% roster, depending on your league. This is a matchup that's going to be really good for fantasy football. Like I've said throughout the course of the week, two bad defenses that have both allowed a lot of fantasy points to essentially every position in last season. So if Trevor Lawrence is out there, he is as good as a streaming option as you're going to get here last minute. Don't forget about his tight end one, that's Brenton Strange, who gets a fantastic matchup once again here against the Panthers. If you bit the bullet at the tight end position, kick the can during your draft, Brenton Strange, I think, has a lot of upside, could potentially find the end zone in a great matchup. I'm not going to talk about this matchup anymore until we get to fantasy Q&A for the week, I promise, but Brenton Strange, a great streaming option at tight end here in week one. Still think Hunter Henry, who might be out there floating around in full PPR, is worth the addition as well. Should be a true security blanket for Drake May in his sophomore season. They had great chemistry last year. Don't love him in like half PPR format. It's going to be a little bit too touchdown dependent, but ultimately I think in full PPR, he can live in that kind of 9 to 12 point area. So if Hunter Henry's out there, you're hurting that tight end, got nothing better, he is a viable option here in week one. Last but not least, we got Zach Ertz of the Washington Commanders, a little bit higher rostered overall. Not the best matchup against the Giants, and yeah, he's a bit touchdown dependent. Most of these streaming option tight ends are going to be, but still in a very good offense with a very good quarterback who gave him a very productive season last year. So Zach Ertz is out there. You can always take a dart throw. The floor is pretty safe here. The upside's not extreme, but I still think he's a viable start in week one. And there you guys have it. There are your last minute waiver wire additions as we move into week one's weekend. I know we got 2 games down already for week one. It feels like the season is crumbling apart, but don't panic, guys. It is a long season. If you guys have any fantasy football questions whatsoever, drop them in the comments down below. I'll answer every single comment on this video. If you guys are new to the channel, this is all we do here all year long. free fantasy football content, redraft, dynasty, and best ball. If you're into that, be sure to subscribe on the way out. And when the playlists pop up all over the screen, make sure you guys go check out some more of our week 1 videos. We have everything you could possibly need to dominate week 1 of the season. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.